Throw it away, Calder Reeves said, sliding the application across the polished walnut desk. No degree, not a single letter of reference, 3 cleaning jobs at once, and yet she demands to be home before 7 every evening. This kind of person, sir, isn't worth a second of your time. Rowan Blackwood hadn't intended to look. On the top floor of Blackwood Manor, where the whole city of Ashford stretched out below him like a chessboard he had long grown used to winning, there were 100 things more worthy of his attention than an application for a housemaid. But then his eyes caught the name handwritten at the bottom of the page, Maeve Donnelly. The pen turning between his fingers stopped dead in the air. 28 years old, a single mother. She had mopped hospital corridors before dawn, cleaned hotel rooms on the night shift, scrubbed the floors of 3 office towers before the sun came up, a resume anyone in this building would have brushed aside in 5 seconds. And yet, Rowan Blackwood's face darkened, and the hand resting on the desk slowly closed into a fist. Because 8 years ago, on a night when the rain came down like a lash, when he lay collapsed in a dark alley behind the old harbor, 3 wounds in his body, and not a single soul willing to stop a stranger, had knelt down beside him in the filthy water. She had pulled off her own thin coat and pressed it hard against the bleeding. She had kept him conscious with a soft, trembling voice through the longest 17 minutes of his life. And when the wail of an ambulance rose at the mouth of the alley, she quietly melted into the rain, vanishing before he could even whisper a request for her name. He had survived. From the ashes of the man who nearly died in that alley, he built an empire. He had sat behind desks people needed permission just to approach, had made the most powerful figures in Ashford lower their heads when he entered a room. For 8 long years he had quietly sent men searching every corner of this EC for the woman who had handed him back his life. He had never found her, and now, there she stood in the ground floor hall, her calloused hands gripping the strap of a worn cloth bag, head bowed, asking only to be allowed to scrub the floors of his estate. Rowan did not explain himself. He had never been the kind of man who needed to. He simply folded the application closed and set it down on the desk with a care that made Calder fall instantly silent, then spoke, his voice low, even, and cold as a blade just drawn from its sheath. Clear my entire afternoon. And Calder, he looked up, his gray eyes so cold the veteran steward instinctively took half a step back. Anyone in this building who dares mock Maeve Donnelly one more time will learn, by morning, exactly why it was the most expensive mistake of his life. And so the man all of Ashford had learned to fear remained seated, his eyes fixed on the glass wall, ready to face for the first time in 8 years the woman who had saved his life. Never once suspecting that she too, in that very moment, was holding a secret of her own. A small secret, only 6 years old, sleeping quietly in their cramped apartment at the far end of the city, with a heart that grew a little weaker with every passing day. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel, so that each week we can listen together to more stories of kindness finding its way home. That morning, before her name was placed on the walnut desk inside the mansion on the hill, Maeve Donnelly sat on a hard plastic chair in the small clinic at the far end of the city, her 2 hands folded together on her lap, listening to the doctor say the things she had been afraid of hearing for many long months. Posey's heart needed to be repaired, and it needed to be repaired soon. There was a small hole between 2 chambers of her heart, something the doctor explained in the gentlest voice he could manage. But no matter how softly he spoke, the number that appeared at the end of the conversation still felt heavy as Alden dropping into her chest. $80,000. He added that the hospital might be able to cover part of it, that there were donation programs, but the remaining amount was still a mountain that a woman who scrubbed floors through 3 shifts a day could never climb with her bare hands. Maeve nodded. She didn't cry in the clinic. She had learned long ago that tears were a luxury, meant only for moments when no one was watching. And right then, too many people were watching, including the little girl sitting beside her, swinging her legs on the chair, her blonde hair tied into 2 small braids, clutching a stuffed rabbit, with one worn-out ear against her chest. She thanked the doctor, took the stack of papers, and led her child by the hand out into the hallway flooded with early morning sunlight. On the way back to the apartment, Posey talked without stopping about a caterpillar she had seen in the schoolyard, about how her teacher had promised that next week the whole class would paint pictures with watercolors, and about how the stuffed rabbit's name was Pip, and Pip liked cookies very much. Maeve listened to every word, answered each sentence, and smiled whenever the little girl looked up at her, waiting for a reaction. 6 years old, and that tiny heart was growing more tired with every passing day. Yet no one looking at that radiant smile could have guessed it. Posey didn't know about the number 80,000. She only knew that her mother was always there, that every night there was always a story before bed, and that the world at its heart was a kind place. Maeve had given up so many things to keep that belief in her child from trembling, and she would give up even more. The apartment where mother and daughter lived was on the 3rd floor of an old building in the Southern housing complex, where the elevator was broken more often than it worked, and in winter, the wind slipped through the cracks around the windows. That evening, after Posey had fallen asleep with Pip, the rabbit, tucked beneath her chin, Maeve sat down at the kitchen table, spread every bill out in front of her, and began doing what she did every month, adding and adding again numbers that never seemed willing to come together into anything merciful. Rent, electricity, her child's medicine, school fees. She had taken night shifts at the hotel, had accepted one more office building to clean, and it still wasn't enough. Enough to live on, yes. Enough for $80,000, never. It was in that moment, when it seemed there was no road left, that she remembered something an old coworker had told her a few weeks earlier during a break. There was a large mansion on the hill north of the city, a place people called Blackwood Manor, and it was hiring household staff. That coworker had spoken in a voice that was half longing and half caution, saying the place paid twice as much as ordinary jobs, that people said its owner was an extremely wealthy and extremely demanding man, so difficult to satisfy that hardly anyone lasted there. But what made Maeve's heart beat faster wasn't the pay. It was the final detail the other woman added, almost by accident, that the place was willing to advance wages to its workers if they truly needed it. An advance on wages. Maeve looked down at the stack of bills, then looked toward the small room where her daughter was sleeping, her steady breathing carrying faintly through the darkness. She didn't care how demanding the owner of that house was. She didn't care what people whispered about him. She was far too familiar with being looked down on, far too familiar with doors being slammed in the face of a woman with no degree. What was one more floor cleaning job, if it could be the first brick in the road that might save her daughter's heart? The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, Maeve sat at the kitchen table and wrote her job application in the most careful handwriting she had, and in the notes section at the bottom of the page, she wrote only one line, saying that she could take any shift, as long as she was allowed to go home before 7 o'clock in the evening, so she could put her daughter to bed. The road leading up to Blackwood Manor curved through rows of tall trees that had been standing there since before Maeve was born, and the higher she climbed, the more she felt her familiar city falling away behind her, as though it belonged to another life entirely. She had taken 2 buses and then walked the final stretch, because the bus route didn't go all the way up this hill, and when the iron gate finally appeared before her, Maeve stopped for a moment to catch her breath. The gate was so high she had to tilt her head back to see the top, its black iron bars forged into cold, twisting patterns, and behind it lay a yard so wide that the apartment she shared with her daughter could have fit inside it dozens of times over and still left room to spare. She tightened her grip on the strap of her worn canvas bag, the bag that held a copy of her job application, and a pair of cleaning shoes she had brought in case they wanted her to start immediately, and she stepped forward. A man in a black suit came out of the guardhouse before she could even raise her hand to touch the bell. He didn't ask who she was. He simply looked her up and down with the eyes of someone accustomed to sorting people into worthy and unworthy with a single glance, then said something into the small earpiece at his ear that she couldn't make out. 2 more men stood in the yard, also in black suits, also with the posture of people whose job was to make others feel unwelcome. None of them smiled. The whole place was sunk in a strange silence, the expensive silence of places where money had bought even quiet itself, and Maeve, who was used to the noise of apartment blocks and night shifts, felt that silence pressing down on her shoulders like an invisible hand. The gate opened with a soft metallic groan, and she was led across the yard, up the stone steps, and into a great hall where the ceiling soared high overhead, and the stone floor was polished so bright she could see her own blurred reflection in it. An older man was waiting for her there, his back straight, his gray-streaked hair neatly combed, his tailored suit fitted to him down to the last stitch. He looked at the application in her hand before he looked at her face, and when he finally lifted his eyes, there was no hostility in them, only something even harder to endure, the indifference of a man who had already decided she didn't matter. He introduced himself as Calder Reeves, the manor's butler, in the flat voice of someone reading from a list. He took her application, instructing her to wait in the grand hall, and turned to carry the paper up to the master of the house. It was during those few minutes upstairs that the conversation at the walnut desk took place, where Rowan Blackwood recognized her name and issued his ice-cold warning. When Calder returned down the grand staircase, the dismissive indifference in his eyes had completely vanished, replaced by a tense, defensive caution. Without another word of hesitation, the veteran steward formally gestured toward the stairs and told Maeve that the master of the manor was ready to receive her immediately. She was led up the curving staircase, past a long hallway hung with dark paintings, and then to a spacious study on the highest floor, where a wall made entirely of glass looked down over the whole city of Ashford spread out below in the afternoon light. The man sitting behind the walnut desk didn't stand when she entered. He only looked up, and Maeve saw a face younger than she had expected, with gray eyes and a faint scar running along the bone of his left jaw. He looked at her in a way she wasn't used to, not with Calder's contempt, not with the sorting glance of the guards outside the gate, but with an attention so intense it almost hurt, as though he were trying to read something written across her face in ink that had faded a very long time ago. Maeve didn't recognize him. She had no reason to recognize him. The man sitting before her, in his dark suit, with his hands resting calmly on the desk, surrounded by an entire empire of silence, shared nothing she could see with anyone she had ever met. Her memory, already crowded with faces, hospital corridors, and people she had once helped and then left without asking their names, hadn't kept any face clearly enough to carry it all the way here. She stood there, both hands still gripping the strap of her bag, and waited for this man to tell her whether she had been hired. He asked her name, though the application lying right in front of him had already answered that. She replied that she was Maeve Donnelly. He repeated the name once, very softly, almost only for himself to hear, and Maeve saw something pass through his eyes that she couldn't name. Then he asked her a strange question, whether 8 years ago she had ever passed through the old harbor district on the east side of the city on a rainy night. Maeve frowned. She had passed through so many places in 8 years, had worked so many night shifts, had gone home along so many dark roads in the rain. She said she wasn't sure, that it was a very long time ago, and she had walked so many streets that they blurred into one another. The man nodded slowly, as though that answer had confirmed something he already knew. It was her, he said. It wasn't a question. He said that that night, a man had been left lying in an alley behind the harbor district, abandoned, and a woman had stopped when no one else would. That woman had taken off her coat, had stayed beside him, until the wail of an ambulance came echoing through the rain, and then disappeared into the downpour before she could leave a name. He said he had spent 8 years searching for that woman. Maeve listened to him speak, and scattered pieces of memory began rising in her mind. A bitterly cold, rainy night, a dark alley, a man she had thought would not survive, and the feeling of having to leave in a hurry because she was afraid of being late for her shift. She had done that. She had forgotten it almost immediately afterward, because to her, it had only been one of countless times she had stopped for someone in need, no more and no less. She had never imagined that the man in that alley would become the man now sitting behind this desk. She whispered that she hadn't known, that she truly hadn't known it was him, that she had thought he had. He cut her off with a slight shake of his head and said that he had lived. He said she didn't need to scrub any floors in this mansion, that there was another job he wanted to give her, though he didn't say right away what that job was. He only told her to stay, starting tomorrow, and Maeve, confused as she was, still unable to understand what was happening, thought of the number 80,000 and of Posey's steady breathing in the dark, and she nodded. Although Rowan Blackwood had told her she didn't need to scrub any floors, Maeve still arrived the next morning with her cleaning shoes in her bag, because she was the kind of person who didn't know how to sit still and take a paycheck for doing nothing, and because she didn't truly believe that the promise of a wealthy man could last any longer than the morning mist on this hill. He had given her a vague job, cleaning and reorganizing the study on the second floor, a room filled with books and papers that he said no one had touched in a long time. And Maeve realized at once that this wasn't really a proper job, but she didn't complain. She tied up her hair, rolled up her sleeves, and began working as though it were the most important room in the entire mansion. What she didn't know was that Rowan Blackwood wasn't the kind of man who gave trust to anyone simply because of an old debt. In the world he had lived in for the past 8 years, gratitude was a luxury, and innocence was a deadly thing, and he had learned that the only way to know who a person truly wasn't to listen to what they said, but to watch what they did when they believed no one was looking. So he did something that Calder Reeves watched with clear confusion on his face. On the wooden desk in the study, right in the middle of the pile of papers Maeve would have to clear away, Rowan placed a wristwatch. It wasn't an ordinary watch. Calder knew its value well, knew it was worth more than all the money that woman could earn in many years combined, and he didn't understand why his employer would leave such an object lying so carelessly within reach of a stranger who had arrived only 1 day earlier. When he couldn't help asking whether it was an oversight, Rowan only looked at him with calm gray eyes and said it wasn't an oversight, that it was the fastest way to learn something he needed to know. Calder withdrew in silence, carrying with him a kind of bewilderment he wasn't used to, because in all the years he had served this man, he had never seen him pay such close attention to anyone, much less to a housemaid wearing her heavily patched shoes. Maeve found the watch in the afternoon, when she lifted a stack of documents to wipe the desk beneath it. She picked it up, and although she didn't know its exact value, she didn't need to know. Its weight in her palm, the cool metal, the way the light caught on its glass face, all of it told her that this object belonged to a world impossibly far from her own. For one very brief moment, a thought passed through her mind, not the thought of taking it, but the thought of how many months of medicine for her daughter such a small thing could pay for, how much of the $80,000 mountain pressing down on her chest every night it might help fill. But the thought came and went like a breath, leaving nothing behind, because Maeve Donnelly had gone through her entire life without ever taking what didn't belong to her, and she didn't intend to begin now. She placed the watch in the most visible spot on the desk, setting it neatly where its owner would not have to worry for even 1 second that it had been misplaced, and then she continued her work. When Rowan entered the study at the end of the day, the watch was still there, in the most visible place, clean and untouched, carefully wiped like everything else in the room. He picked it up, looked at it for a long while, then looked toward the woman placing the last books back onto the shelves, unaware that she had just passed a test very few people in his life had ever managed to pass. He said nothing to her about the watch. He only stood there for a moment, and for the first time since that rainy night 8 years ago, something very much like relief brushed against the chest of the man all of Ashford feared. It happened during Maeve's second week working at the mansion, when the babysitter she usually relied on every afternoon suddenly fell ill, leaving her with no choice but to bring Posey along. She had hesitated for a very long time before making the decision, had prepared an apology in her head, and even braced herself for the possibility of being fired, because she didn't believe a place as cold and expensive as Blackwood Manor had room for a 6-year-old child with 2 blonde braids, clutching her favorite toy, Pip the rabbit. She told her daughter to sit still in the small room beside the study, not to run around, not to bother anyone, and Posey had nodded solemnly with all the seriousness a child could gather, which, as every mother knows, usually lasts about 10 minutes. Sure enough, less than half an hour later, while Maeve was cleaning downstairs, Posey had wandered off, following the ticking sound of a large grandfather clock in the hallway, and her little feet led her straight to the doorway of the room where Rowan Blackwood was sitting and working alone, the man whose name made the entire city lower. Its voice looked up and saw a child standing at his office door, clutching a stuffed rabbit, her eyes wide as she looked at him not with fear, but with the frank curiosity of someone who hadn't yet learned that there were certain people in this world one should stay away from. Posey didn't run. She tilted her head, looked at the faint scar along his jaw, and asked in her clear little voice whether he had fallen off a bicycle, because a boy in her class named Toby had a scar just like that on his chin after falling off his bike, and Toby said having a scar meant being brave. Rowan, who had faced the most dangerous men in Ashford without blinking, suddenly found himself not knowing how to answer a question from a 6-year-old child. He set his pen down, and after a brief silence, he said yes, it was an old scar. And Posey nodded with an air of deep understanding, then informed him that in that case, he must be a very brave person. The little girl stepped all the way into the room without waiting to be invited and began telling him about the rabbit named Pip, about how Pip liked cookies very much, but her mother said cookies weren't good for rabbits, about how next week her whole class was going to paint with watercolors, and how she planned to paint a house with a chimney. Rowan listened. He didn't know why he was listening, why he didn't call someone to take this child away, but there was something in the girl's unguarded innocence that kept him sitting still where he was. It had been a very long time since anyone had walked into this room without carrying either fear or calculation, and this child carried neither. Then Posey looked around the enormous room with its tall bookshelves and glass wall, overlooking the entire city, and she said something that made something in Rowan's chest tighten quietly. She said his house was really big, but it was so quiet, that her house was tiny and very noisy, because her mother always sang when she cooked, and then she asked whether being alone in such a big place made him sad. Rowan couldn't answer that question. He looked at the child standing in the middle of his empty room, and for a moment he no longer saw Posey, but something from very far away, a small warm kitchen full of human voices, a time in his life before this expensive silence became all he had. Just then Maeve rushed breathlessly to the doorway, her face pale with fear, and began apologizing in a flustered rush, pulling her daughter back toward her, explaining that the child hadn't meant to disturb him. But Rowan only raised one hand, gently, and said it was all right. He looked at Posey once more and told her, in the deep voice that usually made adults wary but had now softened in a strange way, that her rabbit Pip was a very lucky rabbit. Posey smiled brightly and waved goodbye to him as her mother led her away, completely unaware that she had just touched a place in that man's heart that no one had been able to reach in 8 years. The days that followed passed in a rhythm. Maeve had protected for years the way one protects a small flame in the wind. Every morning, before the sky was fully light, she woke before the alarm clock, poured a bowl of cereal for Posey, and drank a thin cup of coffee herself while standing beside the sink. Then she woke her daughter by softly singing an old song her own mother had once sung to her. Posey always grumbled for the first half-minute, then burst into laughter, and mother and daughter would brush those 2 blonde braids together in front of the small bathroom mirror, talking as they did about whether Pip the rabbit should stay home that day to guard the door or be allowed to go to school with her. On the way to school, they walked past 3 blocks, and Posey would hop over the cracks in the sidewalk according to a complicated set of rules only she understood, stopping to greet the tabby cat that was always lying in the sun in front of the bakery, and telling her mother about her grand plans for the school day ahead. Maeve held that small hand tightly in her own, and every time the little girl laughed, she felt the $80,000 mountain inside her grow a little lighter, not because it had become any smaller, but because she was reminded exactly why she was willing to climb over it. What Maeve didn't know was that a man had begun to notice that small rhythm belonging to her and her daughter. Rowan Blackwood wasn't a man who took curiosity in other people's lives. He had spent 8 years building walls between himself and the rest of the world, but ever since that afternoon, when the blonde-haired child stood in the middle of his empty room and asked if he was sad, something inside him refused to return to where it had been. He began paying attention to small details he would never have cared about before. He noticed that Maeve always left the mansion on time so she could pick up her child, never even a minute late, and that she worked with a quiet diligence that didn't demand anyone's attention. He noticed that she wrapped up the leftover bread from her lunch to take home instead of throwing it away. He noticed that her glued shoes had been patched once more in a different place, and that she never complained about anything. One morning, from the glass window on the upper floor of the mansion, Rowan happened to look down and saw Maeve and Posey walking along the sloping road leading down to the foot of the hill, because that day she had brought her child near the place where she worked before turning back toward the road to school. He stood there, the coffee growing cold in his hand, and watched the mother bend down to retie her daughter's shoelace, watched the child tip her head back and laugh at something her mother had just said, watched their two small shadows fall across the broad road. He couldn't remember the last time he had witnessed something so simple and tender. In his world, people came together out of fear or advantage, and tenderness was a language he had almost entirely forgotten. But that woman, the one who had once knelt in dirty rainwater to save a stranger and then left without needing a word of thanks, was still living her life in that same gentle way, even while carrying on her shoulders something he didn't yet know by name. Calder Reeves, who had continued watching his employer with growing bewilderment, once gathered the nerve to remark that his employer seemed different lately. Rowan didn't deny it. He only kept looking down at the road where mother and child had disappeared around the bend, and said, almost only to himself, that some people carried light with them without ever knowing it, and that it had been far too long since this house had seen that kind of light cross its threshold. He didn't know that only a few days later, that light would be threatened by a darkness he knew far too well, and that he would have to choose what kind of man he was. The light that Maeve and her daughter had unknowingly brought into the mansion had awakened something in Rowan Blackwood that he thought he had buried a very long time ago, because that blonde-haired child with her question about sadness had, without meaning to, opened a door back into a past he rarely allowed himself to enter. Very few people in Ashford knew how Rowan Blackwood had grown up, and that was exactly how he wanted it. People only saw the empire, the mansion on the hill, the procession of black cars, and the expensive silence, and they assumed that a man with that much power must have been born into luxury. The truth was the complete opposite. Rowan had grown up in apartments even more cramped and run down than Maeve's third-floor apartment, the son of a woman named Eleanor Blackwood, who had spent her whole life cleaning houses for wealthy families in the upper part of the city. He remembered his mother through the scent of laundry soap and floor wax that always clung to her cracked hands, through the way she always saved the best part of every meal for him and said she wasn't hungry, through the soft songs she sang when she thought he had already fallen asleep. Eleanor was a kind woman, full of dignity, but dignity didn't protect her from the way wealthy employers treated her. From the time he was very small, Rowan had seen how they spoke to his mother as though she weren't entirely human, how they cut her wages with made-up excuses because they knew a poor housekeeper couldn't sue anyone, how they made her stand waiting outside a door in the cold while they took their time inside. He remembered once when a mistress of the house accused her of stealing a piece of jewelry that the woman herself had simply misplaced somewhere, and he remembered his mother's face when she came home that night, not the face of someone angry, but the face of someone too exhausted to even be angry anymore. Eleanor never complained. She only kept working, kept lowering her head, kept believing that if she lived honestly, then in the end the world would be kind to her in return. But the world wasn't kind. When Rowan was 17, his mother began to cough, a small cough at first that kept growing worse. She didn't go to the doctor, because going to the doctor meant losing a day's pay, and losing a day's pay meant falling short on rent. She kept putting it off, kept drinking cheap medicine bought from the corner pharmacy, kept telling him she was fine, until one morning she could no longer get out of bed to go to work. By the time Rowan scraped together enough money and managed to take her to the hospital, it was too late. The illness had gone too far, and something that might have been treated if it had been found early had now become a sentence. He had sat beside his mother's hospital bed and watched the woman who had sacrificed everything for him die for a reason so simple and so cruel it hollowed him out completely, because they didn't have enough money, and because not one of the wealthy families she had served her whole life cared whether she lived or died. It was in that hospital room that Rowan Blackwood became someone else. He swore to himself that he would never be powerless again, that no one would ever be able to look down on him, or the people he loved the way they had looked down on his mother. He climbed his way up through an unforgiving world, did things he would never speak of, and built power with a calculated ruthlessness. But amid all that ruthlessness, he kept one rule for himself that he never broke. He never harmed the vulnerable, and he punished without mercy anyone who used their strength to crush those who couldn't fight back. And now, looking at Posy with her 2 blonde braids, and Maeve with hands calloused from cleaning, Rowan saw his mother again so clearly it almost hurt, and he understood that there were some debts in life a person couldn't repay to the dead, only to the living, That morning, Maeve arrived at the mansion nearly half an hour later than usual, something that had never happened since the day she began working there. And the moment she stepped inside, Rowan knew at once that something was wrong. Her face had gone pale, her hands trembled faintly as she hung up her canvas bag, and though she tried to keep herself looking normal, tried to begin her work the way she did every day, there was a tension in every movement of her body that he couldn't help but notice. He asked her what had happened, and at first Maeve shook her head, saying it was nothing, that she had only missed the bus. But Rowan Blackwood had spent his whole life reading the things people tried to hide, and he simply stood there, patient and silent, until the fragile wall she had built finally broke apart. She told him that last night, in the apartment building where she lived, something terrible had happened to her elderly neighbor, an old woman named Dorothy, who lived in the apartment at the end of the third-floor hallway and had been in that building for nearly 30 years. Strange men had come knocking on the old woman's door late at night, not to ask questions, but to threaten her, telling her she had 1 week to move out, and that if she didn't leave the apartment willingly, unpleasant things would happen. They had said it in the most polite tone, the kind of politeness that was even more frightening than shouting, and old Dorothy had sat crying all night in her dark apartment because the electricity had been cut off 3 days earlier. Maeve said it wasn't the first time. For months now, her entire apartment building had been living under a fear that kept rising higher and higher. Power and water were cut off without any proper reason. Anonymous warning letters were slipped under doors, and rumors spread that the whole building was about to be torn down, so something shinier could be built in its place. People said a large corporation was behind it all, a corporation that wanted to drive those poor people out in order to seize the land they were living on, and they were doing it by making life there impossible to endure. Maeve said she had tried to find out more, had tried to ask around, but she was only a woman who scrubbed floors, with no power and no influence, and people like her had no voice. She told him all of this not because she was begging Rowan for help, because she didn't even think he would care about the fate of a poor apartment building on the other side of the city. She told him only because he had asked, and because the weight inside her chest from the night before had become too heavy for her to carry alone any longer. But while she spoke, Rowan had grown unusually silent, and when she mentioned the name of the corporation people had been whispering about, the name old Dorothy had overheard from those strange men, Maeve saw a change in his face that she had never seen before. His gray eyes darkened, and something very cold, very still, rose behind them. He asked her one question, slowly and clearly, whether the name she had just mentioned was Merrick Ash. Maeve nodded, surprised that he knew. Rowan said nothing more right away. He walked to the glass wall overlooking the city, clasped his hands behind his back, and stood there for a long while in a silence that even Calder, who had just entered the room, did not dare to break, because Rowan Blackwood knew exactly who Merrick Ash was. He had known the man for years, had faced him across deals in which Ash always chose the dirtiest path, had witnessed the way he treated human beings as nothing more than numbers on a spreadsheet, things that could be erased to make room for profit. And now, the apartment building Merrick Ash wanted to crush was the place where the woman who had saved Rowan's life was living, the place where the child, who had asked whether he was sad, slept every night. When Rowan finally turned back, his face had returned to its familiar cold composure, but beneath that composure, a decision had already been made. He told Maeve, in a low voice as firm as stone, that from this moment on she no longer needed to worry about her apartment building, and that certain men were about to relearn the lesson of whom they were allowed to touch and whom they were not. 2 days later, Merrick Ash received an invitation he couldn't refuse, not because he wanted to go, but because the way the invitation was delivered made refusing it a mistake. He arrived at the Blackwood Group office in the city center late in the afternoon, walking through the silent corridors with the stride of a man who believed he was no less powerful than the owner of the place. Merrick Ash was a man around 40, dressed expensively in the showy manner of the newly rich, with a smile that always lingered on his lips but never reached his eyes. He had built his entire fortune on parcels of land taken from the poor, on neighborhoods flattened to the ground and people pushed out into the street, and he considered that business talent, not a crime. To him, compassion was a luxury reserved for the weak, and the world was simply divided into those who knew how to take and those who allowed themselves to be taken from. Rowan received him in the office on the upper floor and didn't invite him to sit right away, leaving him standing there for a while in silence, because he understood the value of silence when used against a man who always needed to fill every empty space with the sound of his own voice. When Merrick finally tossed out a joke about not knowing what honor had made Rowan want to see him so urgently, Rowan didn't smile in return. He only pushed a thin folder across the desk toward him and said in an even voice that it was the list of apartments in the southern housing complex that Merrick's men had visited and threatened over the past 3 months, along with every name, every date, and the name of the 80-year-old woman whose electricity had been cut off and who had been threatened with being thrown into the street in the middle of the night. The smile on Merrick's lips stiffened slightly, but he quickly recovered his air of ease, brushed the folder aside, and said Rowan was going too far by concerning himself with such trivial matters, that it was only business, that the people there would be properly compensated and moved somewhere else, and that Rowan knew perfectly well how the world worked. Rowan rose slowly and walked around the desk until he was standing only a short distance from Merrick. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten him with crude words. He only looked straight into the other man's eyes, with gray eyes as cold as steel, and said he wanted Merrick to listen very carefully to what he was about to say, because he would only say it once. He said that apartment building, from this moment on, was under his protection, that every person living inside it, from the old woman on the 3rd floor to the smallest child, was someone Merrick was absolutely not allowed to touch ever again. He said he had spent years learning how Merrick made his money, that he knew which of Merrick's deals couldn't survive the light, and that if one more light in that building was cut, if one more old woman had to cry in the dark, then Merrick would discover that everything he had built was far more fragile than he imagined. Merrick Ash tried to keep smiling, but a flicker of fear passed through his eyes, and both men saw it. Still, he was the kind of man who never backed down in front of another person, and his pride was larger than his fear. He stepped back toward the door, adjusted his collar, and said in a voice that tried to sound casual that Rowan was making a mistake by turning a business matter into something personal because of some housemaid. He said Rowan should remember that he wasn't the only man in Ashford with friends and power, and that there were some things even Rowan Blackwood couldn't protect forever. It was a challenge, and both of them understood it as such. Rowan didn't answer. He only watched Merrick walk out the door, and when the door had closed, he stood still by the window, looking down at the city as its lights began to come on, knowing that he had just drawn a line, and knowing that men like Merrick Ash never respected a line until they threw themselves against it and suffered the consequences. Behind him, Calder quietly reminded him that Merrick would not sit still, and Rowan only gave a slight nod because that was exactly what he was waiting for. That evening, Rowan kept Maeve later than usual, saying he wanted to discuss matters related to the apartment building with her, and she stayed, even though inside her was a tangled mess of emotions she didn't know how to arrange. Over the past few days, she had been living in a strange suspended state, knowing this man was doing enormous things for her neighborhood, knowing that the debt of gratitude between them had now piled up in a way she could no longer measure, and that very feeling of indebtedness had pressed down on her shoulders so heavily that tonight it finally spilled over. When Rowan mentioned that he would handle everything, that she didn't need to worry about anything anymore, something inside Maeve broke open, and she turned toward him with eyes red from exhaustion and from too many sleepless nights gathered together. She said she didn't understand what he wanted from her. She said she was a woman who scrubbed floors, that she had nothing to give back to a man like him, and that she couldn't keep accepting one thing after another without knowing what the true price of it all was. She said she had lived her entire life by the labor of her own hands, that she had never held out her hand and asked anyone for anything, and that if everything he was doing was only the pity of a wealthy man towards someone miserable, then she would rather refuse it all than live beneath the weight of charity. Her voice trembled as she said those words, not because she was angry with him, but because she was so tired of always having to be the weaker one, always having to be the one who received, and her dignity was the last thing she still had left to cling to. Rowan listened to her until the end without interrupting once, and when she was finished, he didn't look offended. He only stood, walked to the window, and stayed silent for a long while, as though deciding whether to open a door he had kept locked for 8 years. Then he began to speak, in a low, slow voice she had never heard from him before, a voice stripped of the ice of power he usually wore. He told her he was going to tell her something he had never told anyone. He spoke about that night in the alley, but he didn't retell what had happened, because they both already knew. Instead, he told her what had happened inside him while he lay there. He said that when he was lying on that cold ground, he was no longer afraid, that all he felt was a strange calm, the calm of a man who had accepted that his life would end in a dark alley, and no one would notice, no one would grieve. He said that in that moment, the thing that hurt him most wasn't death, but the thought that he would leave this world exactly the way he had lived in it, as someone the world had decided was not worth caring about. Then he said that in the middle of all that, a hand had touched him, and a voice had risen beside his ear, a voice that didn't know who he was, didn't know what he had done, didn't demand anything from him, but simply told him to try to stay, that he was going to be all right. He said it was that voice, not the doctor's, not anything else, that had kept him tied to this life. Because in the trembling voice of a strange woman kneeling in dirty rainwater, for the first time in many years, he had heard another human being treat him as though he were a life worth saving. He turned back to look at her, and said that everything he was doing now wasn't pity, and it wasn't repayment either. He said she had given him something no fortune on earth could buy, the belief that he deserved to live, and that someone who had once seen him as worth saving would never, as long as he was alive, have to stand before him and believe she was worth nothing. Maeve stood there, tears quietly streaming down her face, and for the first time since she had stepped through the iron gate of this mansion, the ice between those two wounded people began to thaw. The truth Maeve had been trying not to look at directly for the past several weeks finally came to her one afternoon, not through a confession from Rowan, but through an accidental moment she was never meant to witness. She was carrying a tray of tea up to the study, when she heard voices drifting out from the meeting room beside it, where the door had been left slightly ajar. And although she had no intention of eavesdropping, the words that reached her ears were enough to make her freeze in the middle of the hallway, the tea tray trembling in her hands. She heard people speaking about things she had only ever seen on late-night news reports, about controlled territories, about people who needed to be reminded of their place, about debts collected in ways the law would never touch. She heard Calder's voice, cold and practical, reporting on matters that had been handled, and she heard Rowan's familiar low voice giving brief orders, each word carrying the weight of a kind of power that didn't exist in any law book. Maeve stepped back, set the tray down on a small table in the hallway, and stood there for a while with her heart pounding hard. All the pieces she had deliberately refused to fit together suddenly arranged themselves in her mind. The guards at the gate, the expensive silence, the way the whole city seemed to hold its breath whenever the name Blackwood was mentioned. The way Rowan could make a man like Merrick Ashe afraid with only a few words. She had known. Somewhere deep inside, she had always known that this man was not an ordinary businessman. But knowing something in a vague way and facing it bare and whole were two entirely different things, and now, when there was no longer any way to deceive herself, Maeve felt the ground beneath her feet begin to sway. The man who had saved her neighborhood, the man who had sat and listened to Posey talk about Pip the rabbit, the man who had confessed to her about that rainy night in a voice so vulnerable it had softened her heart, that man was a crime boss, the head of a world filled with darkness and violence. And in that very moment, a fear Maeve had never known before surged up inside her, a fear not for herself, but for her daughter. She thought of Posey, of her 2 blonde braids, of that tiny heart already far too fragile, and she thought of the world she was unknowingly pulling her child closer to. She had seen what happened to people connected to this world, had read about innocent people being swept into acts of revenge that had nothing to do with them, and the thought that her daughter could become a pawn, a weakness for Rowan's enemies to aim at, sent a coldness down her spine. Merrick Ashe had said there were some things even Rowan Blackwood couldn't protect forever, and now those words echoed in her mind like a curse. She couldn't gamble with Posey's life. She couldn't. Maeve stood in the mansion's magnificent hallway, torn between 2 feelings pulling her in opposite directions. Part of her was filled with deep gratitude for the man who had done so much for her. Part of her had begun to feel something even warmer than gratitude whenever she thought of him, and she knew Rowan was not a cruel man, that beneath that layer of icy power was a person who had been deeply wounded and had somehow still kept a heart. But the mother inside her, the part of her that had sacrificed everything and would sacrifice everything for her child, that part was screaming that she had to take Posey away from this place before it was too late. That night, she went home and sat for a long time beside her daughter's bed, watching the little girl sleep with Pip the rabbit tucked beneath her chin, and she cried in silence because she knew that no matter which road she chose, something precious would break. Merrick Ash wasn't the kind of man who swallowed a challenge without answering it, and his wounded pride was even more dangerous than his greed. He decided that if Rowan Blackwood wanted to turn that poor apartment building into something personal, then he would show him that he, too, knew how to play that game, and he chose to strike on a night when he believed he could create enough chaos to force the people there to run once and for all. But there was one thing Merrick didn't know, and that was that Rowan had already anticipated this move. From the moment he drew that line with him, Rowan had quietly placed men around the neighborhood day and night. And more important than anything else, he had done something. Maeve would later be grateful for all her life. When the first signs appeared that afternoon, showing Merrick was about to make his move, Rowan's people quietly went to every apartment with young children, and with Maeve's help, along with a few trusted neighbors, they moved all the children in the apartment building, including Posey, to a safe place far from the neighborhood before night fell. Posey was taken to the home of one of Maeve's friends in another district, together with the other children, a place with a reliable person watching over them, where the children were given cookies and allowed to watch cartoons, completely unaware of anything happening in the place they still called home. When night fully came down, Merrick's men drove into the neighborhood with their headlights off. They arrived intending to cause enough damage to make the remaining residents understand that staying was no longer a choice. The air inside the apartment building was thick with tension. The remaining residents huddled behind dark windows, their hearts pounding, listening to the engines shut off and the car doors slam in the courtyard below. Old Dorothy on the third floor clutched her shawl tightly around her shoulders, praying silently in her dark apartment. For months, these people had lived in fear, and now that fear too was taking shape right at the foot of their building, in the form of shadowed men stepping out of black cars and moving toward the entrance with the stride of men who believed the night belonged to them. But tonight would not belong to them, because when the leader of Merrick's men had just placed his hand on the building's front door, he realized something was wrong. The neighborhood was too quiet. There was no sound of children crying, none of the panic they had expected, none of the terror they had come to spread. And then, from the darkness of the courtyard, from behind the blind corners they had passed without noticing, figures began to step out, silent and steady, blocking every exit Merrick's men had used to enter. Rowan's people had already been there, waiting in silence, and now they emerged in the dark courtyard, as though the darkness itself had given birth to them. The leader froze, his hand leaving the door, and for the first time that night, the man who had come to create fear suddenly felt that very fear slide down his own spine. In the middle of that stillness stretched tight as a wire, a low, even voice rang out from behind Merrick's men, and all of them turned. Rowan Blackwood stepped out of the darkness, unhurried, without a trace of fear, his hands tucked into the pockets of his dark coat, and the only streetlight still burning cast its glow across half his face and the faint scar along his jaw. He glanced over the men blocking the courtyard, then looked at their leader and said he had warned their employer about whom he was allowed to touch and whom he was not, and it seemed that warning had not been delivered clearly enough. He said that tonight, not one brick of this building would be moved, not one person inside it would shed a single tear, and that the men standing before him had two choices: either walk out of here on their own immediately, or stay and learn why all of Ashford knew there were certain names that should not be challenged. The courtyard sank into a deathly silence, and everyone there knew that the choice was about to be made. The leader of Merrick's men was the kind of man who only knew how to be forceful when his opponent was weaker than he was. and his pride in front of his subordinates would not allow him to retreat, so he chose wrongly. He signaled to his men, and in an instant, the dark courtyard erupted into a chaos of bodies rushing at one another. But if Merrick's men thought they were facing people who would be easily subdued, they were badly mistaken. Rowan's men were not a scattered pack of street thugs. They moved with the quiet coordination and discipline of men accustomed to controlling every situation, and in just a few short minutes, the advantage had shifted completely to their side. Maeve, standing tucked behind a corner of the wall, where Rowan had told her to stay still, watched the scene with her breath trapped in her chest. And what kept her from looking away was not the chaos, but the man standing in the middle of it. Rowan Blackwood moved through the courtyard with a calm that was almost frightening, never hurried, never making a single wasted motion. While everything around him was shoving bodies and harsh breaths, he still carried the composure of a man in complete command of the situation. And every time one of Merrick's men lunged at him, it took only one decisive, precise movement for that man to find himself on the ground, dazed and stripped of all will to fight. He didn't strike to injure. He struck to end things, to make every man who faced him understand at once that all resistance was pointless. There was a force radiating from him in that moment that made even the most reckless men hesitate, a force that did not come from size or raw strength alone, but from the absolute certainty that he would not lose, could not lose. Not tonight, not on this piece of ground where innocent people were relying on him. The leader, seeing his men fall one after another around him, tried to flee toward the cars, but Rowan blocked his path. The two men faced each other in the courtyard that had now fallen quiet, and the leader, with all the aggression he still had left, rushed at him in one final effort. Rowan avoided the attack with an ease that was almost bored. Then, with one clean movement, he knocked the man off balance and sent him face down onto the cold ground, and before he could struggle back up, Rowan had placed one hand on his shoulder, pinning him down with a strength that could not be moved. He bent close and said in a low voice, just loud enough for the man to hear, that he should go back and tell Merrick Ash this was the final warning, that next time there would be no conversation, and that if one more person in this neighborhood was threatened again, Merrick would lose far more than he could imagine. The leader, his face drained of blood, nodded again and again in absolute terror. Rowan stood up straight and let him go, and like a pack of defeated animals, Merrick's men scrambled to their feet, helped one another toward the cars, and fled the neighborhood as fast as they could, leaving behind a courtyard where there was now only the wind and the sound of breathing slowly returning to normal. The dark windows began to glow again one by one, and the residents of the apartment building, people who had lived far too long in fear, timidly stepped out onto their balconies and looked down into the courtyard, where the man who had stood up to protect them was quietly straightening the collar of his coat. Not one of them had ever imagined there would come a day when a man like that would stand on their side. Maeve stepped out from the corner of the wall, her legs trembling, and when her eyes met Rowan's across the courtyard, she saw in those gray eyes not the triumph of a man who had just won, but something tired and gentle, the gaze of a man who had just done what had to be done to keep something fragile intact. That night, for the first time in a very long while, the southern apartment building slept in peace. The danger from Merrick had been pushed back, and when everything had settled, Maeve and her neighbors went to bring the children home with a kind of relief. Only people who had just survived a long and frightening night could understand. Posy ran straight into her mother's arms, still clutching Pip the rabbit, chattering nonstop about the cartoon she had just watched, and the star-shaped cookie the babysitter had given her. Maeve held her child tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair, and in that moment she believed the worst had passed. But the life of a mother with a child whose heart was fragile was a life spent always standing guard, and that peace lasted only a few short days. One evening, while mother and daughter were at home and Maeve was preparing dinner, she noticed Posy suddenly growing quieter than usual. The little girl sat curled up on the sofa, her small face turning pale, and when Maeve asked if something was wrong, Posy only said she felt a little tired, that it was a little hard to breathe. An icy fear Maeve had lived with for years tightened around her at once. She knelt beside her daughter, placed a hand on that small chest, and felt her child's heartbeat moving in a way she knew was wrong, too fast and then too weak. while the little girl's breathing became shallow and hurried. Everything the doctor had ever warned her about rang through her mind all at once, and she understood that this was exactly what she had always feared, that her daughter's heart had reached the edge of its strength, that she needed to be taken to the hospital immediately. Maeve tried to keep her voice calm as she told her daughter that everything would be all right, that Mommy was going to take her to see the doctor, but inside her was an entire storm of panic. She lifted the child into her arms, reached for her phone, and in that desperate moment, the first person her trembling fingers searched for was none other than Rowan. He answered after only one ring, and the instant he heard Maeve's broken, terrified voice, heard her say that Posey wasn't all right, that the little girl needed to get to the hospital now. Rowan's usual composure vanished, replaced by an urgency even Calder had never seen in him. He said only one thing to her, that he was coming, and that she should stay right there with her child, and Rowan Blackwood, the man who had remained calm in the middle of a chaotic courtyard only a few nights earlier, now raced down the stairs of his mansion at a speed no one in the household had ever witnessed. His car tore through the city night, and in an unbelievably short time, he was standing outside the door of Maeve's third-floor apartment. He didn't waste a single second. He gently took Posey from Maeve's weakened arms, holding the little girl against his chest, as carefully as though he were carrying the most precious thing in the world, and told Maeve in a deep, certain voice that he would take her to the best place, that she would be all right, that Maeve should hold on to him and not let go. On the way to the hospital, while Maeve sat in the back seat holding her child and whispering comfort into her ear, softly singing the song she sang to her every morning, Rowan drove and made phone calls, and through the phone, Maeve heard him give orders in a voice that allowed no delay. He demanded that the best hospital in the city be ready, demanded that the finest cardiologist be present, and made it clear that every cost, no matter how much, was not a matter for discussion. When the car rushed up to the entrance of the emergency department, a team of doctors and nurses was already waiting, and Rowan personally handed Posey over to them, standing there as he watched the small bed being hurried inside with an expression on his face. Maeve would never forget the expression of one of the most powerful men in the city facing the one thing his power could not command. The tiny heart of a child. The hospital Rowan took Posey to was not the kind of hospital Maeve could ever have gone to on her own. It was a place of bright hallways and advanced equipment, a place where simply stepping through the doors seemed worth more than an entire month of her wages. The cardiologist Rowan had summoned was one of the finest in the country, a man people usually had to wait months to see, and yet tonight he was there in less than 1 hour, because when Rowan Blackwood asked for something, the world had a way of rearranging itself so that it happened. Posey was taken straight into surgery, and the operation that should have required months of waiting and saving, the $80,000 surgery that had once been the impossible mountain in Maeve's sleepless nights, was now carried out immediately, without a single person mentioning money, because Rowan had handled everything with one phone call and one signature, sweeping aside every barrier that money had built between a child and her life. And then came the hardest part, the part even Rowan's power could not touch, the waiting. He sat with Maeve on the hard chairs in the hallway outside the operating room, beneath the cold white lights, and time passed with a slowness that felt cruel. Maeve sat folded over herself, her hands clenched tightly together, her lips moving faintly with prayers, and Rowan sat beside her in silence. But inside that man, something was happening that no one else could see. Because this hospital hallway, with its smell of antiseptic, its white lights, and its suffocating waiting, had pulled him back to a place he had tried not to return to for many years. He had once sat on a chair like this, in a hallway like this, many years before, when he was only 17 and the person lying behind that door was his mother. He remembered that feeling of helplessness, the feeling of a poor boy waiting for news about the only woman in the world who loved him, knowing he had not been able to do anything to save her, knowing that everything that might have saved her had been something his family had never had enough of, money and someone willing to care. He had sworn in that hallway years ago that he would never be that powerless again, and he had spent his entire life turning that vow into truth, gathering power and wealth until nothing could slip beyond his reach. But now, sitting in this hallway, and waiting for news about a blonde-haired child with a stuffed rabbit, he realized a truth that was bitter and beautiful at the same time. That all the power he had built had finally found a meaning. That tonight, this time, he had been able to do exactly what he could not do when he was 17. He had been able to give a waiting mother on the other side of that door the chance his own mother had never had. Maeve, in the middle of her consuming fear, lifted her eyes to him and saw something on the face of this always composed man that she had never seen before. A deep emotion he could no longer hide. She softly asked if he was all right, and Rowan, after a moment of silence, told her in a low, hoarse voice that many years ago he had waited in a place just like this, and that he had not had enough of what was needed to keep the person he loved alive. He said he had not been able to save his mother, but tonight he would not let the same thing happen again, not to Posey, not when he could stop it. Maeve looked at him, and in that moment she understood that everything he was doing was not only for her or for her child, but also the way a man who had carried a wound for 20 years had finally found a path toward healing it. She reached out, placed her calloused hand over his, and those two wounded people sat beside each other in silence, waiting together through the longest hours of their lives. When the operating room door finally opened, and the doctor stepped out with his mask pulled down and a tired smile on his face, Maeve sprang to her feet with her heart seeming to stop, and the words he said next were the most beautiful words she had ever heard in her life. The surgery had been successful. Posey's tiny heart had been repaired, and with time and care she would grow up like any other healthy child. She would run, she would play, and she would no longer grow exhausted every time she exerted herself. Maeve burst into tears, but this time they were tears of overwhelming relief, and she turned toward Rowan, who was standing silently behind her, and she could not find a single word large enough to say. He only gave a slight nod, and in his gray eyes there shone a light she had never seen before, the light of a man who had just been freed from a burden he had carried for far too long. In the days that followed, as Posey slowly recovered in the bright, fully equipped hospital room Rowan had arranged, everything seemed to be moving toward a beautiful ending. The little girl quickly regained her liveliness, asking to draw pictures, asking to tell stories, and every time Rowan came to visit, her small face lit up as she called for him. But it was during those peaceful days that an old fear began to creep back into Maeve's heart, a fear that joy could not completely drive away. She remembered the night she had stood in the mansion hallway and heard the truth about who Rowan really was. She remembered the shadowed world he led, remembered Merrick Ash, and the threat that there were some things even Rowan could not protect forever. She looked at her daughter laughing and playing, the child who had just escaped death's scythe, and she wondered whether she had the right to place that newly saved life within the danger of a world where she did not belong and could never fully understand. Life had taught Maeve that things too beautiful rarely lasted, and her mother's instinct, the instinct that had helped her survive so many difficult years, now whispered to her that the only way to protect her child was to take her far away from all of this. She did not doubt Rowan's heart, not for a single second. But his love could not change the nature of the world he lived in, and Maeve could not bear the thought that one day, because of their closeness to him, her daughter might become a target for those who wanted to hurt him. And so, after many sleepless nights, she made the hardest decision of her life. When Posey was well enough to be discharged from the hospital, Maeve decided she would take her daughter away from Ashford, that they would start over in some distant place, where no darkness could reach the little girl. She did not have the courage to say goodbye to him face to face, because she knew that if she looked into those gray eyes, she would never have the strength to walk away. Instead, she wrote him a letter, in the same careful handwriting as the job application she had written on that long-ago day, and in that letter, she told him everything her heart wanted to say. She thanked him for saving her daughter, for saving her neighborhood, for showing her that even in a harsh world, there were still people willing to stand up and shelter the weak. She told him she would be grateful to him for the rest of her life, that he had become something more precious than she dared to admit, but that she was a mother before she was anything else, and a mother had to place her child's safety above even her own heart. She left the letter on the desk in the study, the place where she had once found the watch, and then she quietly left. And when Rowan read that letter, he stood for a very long time by the window, looking down over the city, and although every cell in him wanted to rush out and find her, he did not. because he understood the fear of a mother, and he knew that true love sometimes meant not forcing someone to stay, but allowing the person you loved the freedom to choose what they believed was right. Maeve and Posey moved to a peaceful small town a few hours away from Ashford, and during their first weeks in the new place, Maeve tried to convince herself that she had done the right thing. She found a job, rented a small apartment with a window overlooking a row of trees, and every morning she still walked Posey to her new school, where the little girl quickly made friends and began running and playing in a way her tired heart had never allowed before. It should have been a beautiful new beginning, but there was an emptiness in Maeve's chest that this new life could not fill, and every night after her daughter had fallen asleep, she found herself thinking of a pair of gray eyes and a low voice, of the man she had left behind in order to protect her child. Then one day, while she was sorting through the paperwork related to Posey's surgery to complete the forms for the new clinic, she discovered something that made her go still. The entire cost of the surgery, that enormous number that had once been the impossible mountain in all her sleepless nights, had been paid in full. Not part of it, all of it, and there was not a single line naming the person who had paid, no reminder, no demand for acknowledgement, as though the one who had done it wanted only for her and her child to be free without carrying even the smallest burden of gratitude. She knew who it was. Of course she knew. And when she learned more, through the news and through stories from old acquaintances in the apartment building, she discovered even more. She learned that Merrick Ash, the man who had spread fear through her entire neighborhood, was now facing justice, not through violence, but through something even heavier for a man like him. Rowan had spent months quietly, gathering every piece of evidence about Merrick's dirty deals, about the times he had coerced and threatened people, about the twisted paths his money had taken to hide its origins, and he had handed all that evidence over to the authorities and the press. Merrick Ash's empire, built on fear and stolen pieces of land, did not collapse in a night of violence, but beneath the light of law and truth, and the people he had once trampled were finally given their peace back. The southern apartment building was preserved, the residents were allowed to stay in their homes, and old Dorothy on the third floor lit the lamp in her apartment every evening again, without having to be afraid. Maeve sat down at the kitchen table in her new apartment, holding the paid bill in her hands, and she cried. But these tears were different from all the tears she had ever shed before. She realized that she had misunderstood what she needed to protect her child from. She had run away from a man she believed would bring darkness into her child's life, when the truth was that the man had used everything he possessed, both his power and the tenderness he kept hidden, to clear the darkness from the path of her and her daughter. And that night, for the first time since the day Posey had been born with her fragile heart, Maeve slept all the way from night until morning, without waking once to bend down and listen to her daughter's breathing. She no longer needed to keep watch. Her child's heart was now healthy, beating steadily and strongly inside that small chest, and the fear that had eaten its way into every night of her life for 6 years finally dissolved. When she woke the next morning and realized she had slept through the entire night, she lay still for a long while in the morning sunlight, and she understood that she could no longer keep running from what her heart had already known. She packed their things, took her daughter's hand, and caught the first bus back to Ashford, returning to the place where a man with gray eyes was still standing beside the window, looking down over the city, waiting for something he had never dared to hope for. That afternoon, Maeve stepped through the iron gates of Blackwood Manor once again, this time not as a woman coming to ask for work and bow her head before the coldness of this place, but with a heart that had finally understood exactly what it wanted. Calder Reeves was the one who opened the door, and on the face of the seasoned butler, where there had once been only indifference, there now appeared a small smile of genuine relief, 'cause he had watched his employer stand silently by the window through all those weeks, and he understood better than anyone what this return meant. But the one who couldn't wait even one more second was Posey. The little girl, her cheeks now rosy and her legs full of life, slipped free from her mother's hand and ran across the wide courtyard at a speed that only a few months earlier her tired heart would never have allowed. And when Rowan stepped out through the front door, she rushed straight into his arms with bright, ringing laughter that filled the courtyard that had once been so silent it felt hard to breathe. In Posey's hands was a carefully folded sheet of paper, and she proudly opened it to show him. It was a watercolor painting, drawn in the clumsy, innocent strokes of a 6-year-old child, showing 3 people standing beside one another in front of a house with a chimney. She pointed to each figure and explained that this was Mommy with reddish-brown hair. This was Posey standing in the middle, holding Pip the rabbit, and this, the tallest figure standing beside them and protecting both mother and daughter, was him. She said she had drawn him on the outside, because her teacher had taught her that the tallest person always stood where they could protect everyone else. Rowan Blackwood, the man whose name had once made all of Ashford lower its voice, took that painting in hands that had made even the most powerful men tremble, and in that moment, something shone in his gray eyes, because he understood that he had just been given something more precious than everything he had built in his entire life. Maeve stood watching the scene from the middle of the courtyard, and when Rowan lifted his eyes to find hers, not a single word needed to be spoken. They both understood that their long, aching journey had finally found its way home. And so, the story of a poor mother who once knelt in the rain to save a stranger, and of the powerful man who spent his life repaying that debt in the only way he knew how, ended not with money or power, but with a watercolor painting and the laughter of a healthy child. Because what this story wants to leave in the heart of each of us is very simple. That a person's dignity is never measured by how much money they have or what position they stand in, but by the heart they give when no one asks for it and when they expect nothing in return. The kindness we offer in our darkest days, no matter how small it may seem, never truly disappears, but quietly finds its way back to us at the very moment we need it most. And sometimes, it is that quiet kindness that becomes a strength greater than any power in the world. If this story has touched your heart, please leave a like and share it with someone you love. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so that every day, we can listen together to more meaningful and moving stories. How do you feel about Maeve and Rowan's story? And what part of this story moved you the most? Please leave a comment below so we can hear the feelings from deep within your heart. May everyone listening to this story always have abundant health, a joyful and peaceful life, and days filled with love. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next stories.